So this week's presentation is about more of the actual, I have both of the pastors or priests. Let me just kind of start over. My brain is not functioning at the moment. So this week's presentation is about some of the families that belonged on the register, and I have the registry here of Trinity, including two of the rectors. So I'm going to get right started there. What you see here is John Francis Hoff. He was the first rector of Trinity, and he was born in Lancaster, Pennsylvania in January of 1814.
Hang on a second, Jenny. I'm not seeing your screen.
You're not seeing my screen anymore?
Yeah.
Oh boy, it says, okay, oh boy. Let me end the show. Okay. And then let me share screen. Share this one. Share.
There we go.
Okay. There we go. Okay. Perfect. Okay. So here we have Reverend John Francis Hoff, born in Lancaster in 1814, graduated from the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, received his theological training in New York and also Virginia, and was ordained in 1837 in Philly. Christ Church in Georgetown was his first placement in 1838, and then he went to Christ Church in Millwood, Virginia in 1847. He moved to Maryland in 1858 and took charge of Trinity until his death. And in 1861, he also took charge of Sherwood Church in Cockeysville until 1871. And that's where he lived during that time, was in Cockeysville. He was a member of the Diocese of Maryland, the Standing Committee, until his death. And he died in 1881 in the residence of W.R. Howard down in Baltimore City on St. Paul Street. He was married to Juliana Johnson. Ross was her maiden name. And she survived him, but not for very long. She was born in 1816 and died in 1884. And we have their children here. And we have Anne Elizabeth, John, Mary, George, William, Catherine, Charles, and Francis Hager. And as you can see, a majority of them did live longer lives, which is, rare for back then. What I have here is, this is him back in 1870, and it has him as the clergyman. And in his home, you can see Yates Jackson, Mary Connolly, Mary Goff, and Ellen Bodley. And so he had a domestic servant, a cook, chambermaid, and nurse. And Yates, Mary, and Ellen were all African Americans. And so we'll learn a little bit more about them as well. So here I have just the obituary of John Hoff, giving you the same background information I already gave you. Just talking about him being a manly and a Christian gentleman of the purest type, and he was the author of valuable contributions to theological literature. And I think it said something like about 13 different pamphlets or something of that nature that he put out, one of which was the Manual for Colored Persons, a manual of religious instruction, especially intended for the oral teaching of colored persons. And this was pre/during Civil War when this was being put out. I have not been able to get a copy of it, but it was widely circulated. On one paper, you could see multiple booksellers selling this exact book. And here we have the article that was stating when he was going to be coming to Trinity. So it just said that he was of Clark County, Virginia, and he accepted the rectorship of Trinity Episcopal Church at Towson Town. The workers for Hoff, we have Yates Jackson. He was born in Virginia in the spring of 1846, and he's living with Hoff as a domestic in 1870. What I find is that in 1900, 1910, and 1920, he's back in Chapel Clark, Virginia, which is the same place Hoff came from. So it almost looks like he may have sent for him to come and be a worker for him. What is interesting also about that is that afterwards he went back to his home and lived with his brother, his uncle, and other family, and he never holds another job. So I don't know if maybe he had some kind of, attachment to the Hoff family, and they brought him up here to work and then sent him home, and then he was cared for by his family, but he never married. Mary Goff, she was born free in Cockeysville to Wesley and Rachel Goff, and is working as a chambermaid. It says she's born in Maryland, and she was listed as a mulatto, a mixed race. And in 1880, she's working in the house of John White in Cockeysville. And I don't see anything after that, but of course, that's the time frame where things are missing for a good chunk of 20 years. So she probably went off and married, and we don't know who she married. The same can be said for Ellen Bodley. She's 13 years old. She's working for Hoff, but there's no other information. I can't see where she came from or where she goes after that. And she's working as a nurse. So basically she's there to take care of the kids. In 1880, we find John Jones, and I believe it's the same John Jones who had his kids baptized at Trinity in 1881 and 1886. It makes the most sense. John Berry, he was born in Maryland in 1862 to George, and it looked like Lesso was the name of his mother, in 1880, and he's listed as a mulatto. Martha Dorsey was born in 1840 in Maryland. She was a widow and a cook. There's no other information after 1880 for her. And Marion Taylor and Jane Addams, both born in the early 1860s, one in Virginia, one in Maryland, but there's no information of them after as well. The next rector, which was Reverend Dr. William Henry Harrison Powers, he was born in June of 1849 in Staunton, Virginia, to Pike and Celia Powers. He also graduated from the Virginia Theological Seminary in Alexandria in 1872, and he became a rector at Episcopal Church in Queens, Virginia. Then he went on to West Virginia to Grafton in 1879 and stayed there until 1882, when he was called to become the rector at Trinity, Holy Comforter, and Good Shepherd in Riderwood from 1882 until 1917, when he died. In 1884, he until his death, he became a member of the Standing Committee of the Episcopal Diocese, and he died on August 10th, 1917 of hyperthyroidism. What's interesting is that his mother, Celia Powers, is actually a Harrison, and so she was related to the president, William Harrison, and that's why William Henry Harrison Powers was named that. And so that was kind of an interesting tidbit. And as well as his father, Pike, he was actually a mathematician and taught college level, and also owned or ran a few academies called Powers Academies in Virginia, where people came from all over to attend, like a boarding school. And then after doing that for quite some time, making a career out of it, he decided to become ordained as well. So he became a minister in his later life. So you can see that this is a thread, as you see over here, because his wife was Sarah Louise Sheffey. She was born in 1849 and died in 1939. And then they had multiple children: Leela, Marguerite, Louise Cole, who married into the Yellett family, Muriel Skitwith, who married into the Grayson family, Reverend Hugh W.F. Powers, who goes on to become and finds the church, the Holy Nativity, down in the Park Heights area, and then Douglas Harrison and Donald Wales. What we have here is we have on the left is W.H.H. Powers. That's from the newspaper after he died, his obituary. And then over to the right is his father. That's Pike. And down in the middle is Reverend Powers, that's his son, Hugh. So all three generations who had worked in the Episcopal Church. Up at the top here, we have mission work discussed, and the speaker of the evening was Dr. William Powers of Towson. He spoke on the mission opportunity, and that actually comes from his father. He was really interested in mission work, and so that's something that he pushed within his own congregation. So you can see that, affected his son. And then we have down here where Pike Powers was part of the Standing Committee on Colored Congregations down in Virginia. The next slide is more about a controversy that took place, but I want to share it because it shows how entrenched Towson was within each other, and especially at Trinity, because the names are Trinity parishioners as well as lawyers, and basically showing that when something happens in Towson, not only does everyone know about it, but everyone's a part of it. So what happened was in 1893, Reverend Powers separated from his wife, Louise, and it was right after the birth of their last son, Donald. She had been accused of trying to poison or convince the maid of another person to poison the wife of a man named Harry Malcolm. And they're staying at the McCaig's boarding house, which is in Towson. Mrs. Powers was arrested. She was served with a notice, and basically what came of this was that there was an agreement that she would be put into a mental institution down in Virginia in her hometown or nearby, and that Reverend Powers would see to her care for the rest of her life. And so, but he would retain the children. And so that's exactly what happened to her. The interesting thing is that if we see here, the story continued, and so this becomes just like probably a gossip center for a couple years, because in 1900, Harry Malcolm, the man whose wife was to be murdered, sues his wife for leaving him and living with her sister, and she accuses him of squandering their money, her estate that she got from her family. But we can see years later that they actually continued to live together. They never divorced. And what we have here is the Cooper boarding house, which shows Harry Malcolm living there, and he's living with the Offutt family, who we will discuss later. And that is that's an important piece of a story to come. When Malcolm was trying to sue his wife for desertion, he was in the care of R.C. Massenburg. That was his friend, who we see over here, who was a known Confederate and Confederate sympathizer, and he was buried at Trinity. And within this, we see other names of Trinity people. So, at this time, we're having Reverend Powers and a very personal situation within his own family being shared with various members of Trinity and the vestry at the time when he is the rector. So it must have been a very difficult time for him and his family, especially since this continues for multiple years. The next family that I like to talk about is the McIntosh family, which is, their names are seen often throughout the church, especially with the windows. Colonel David Gregg McIntosh was born in 1836 and died in 1916. He was from South Carolina to James Halls McIntosh and Martha Gregg, and he graduated from the South Carolina College, and he was admitted to the bar in 1858 in South Carolina. That same year, his father died, and in the will left the following to his wife, which was 105 slaves on his Horse Branch and Cedar Creek plantations near Society Hill. And he names only a few of the 105, as you can see there: Limerick, Old Peter and Isaac, Moses and his wife Terwin, their children Richard, Sophie, Lizzie, Katie, Amand, and Tira, Tom and his wife Marion, and their children Charles, Cheney, Emma, Jane, Molly, Harry, John, Reuben, Turner, Old Sam, and his wife Sophie. The McIntosh family were Confederates, and McIntosh served with the Confederates and accompanied Jefferson Davis and multiple others within a company to surrender at Appomattox. He was quoted as saying that if Jefferson Davis was going to surrender, he would surrender with his friend, but not before that. And so that's why he accompanied him. He married Virginia Pegram, daughter of James West Pegram, General James West Pegram of Richmond, Virginia in 1865, and returned to practice law in South Carolina into 1868. Her family were well-known Confederates as well, including many of her brothers, which I'll talk about shortly. He moved to Towson. McIntosh and his wife moved to Towson to escape the militarization of Reconstruction at the time and began practicing law and buying properties. And so on Sunday, we had my daughter who explained, because she did a whole presentation of this last year, about what the militarization of Reconstruction actually is. And that is when the North went into the South to assure that Reconstruction was actually taking place, because the South wanted to continue as business as usual. And we're not enforcing the Reconstruction laws, especially the amendments that had been passed, the 13th and 14th. And so what also took place was that people were then forced to recognize that they were no longer having this free labor. And so multiple families who were in the risk of losing everything, or who did lose everything, decided to move to the North. And so you find the McIntosh family not immune to that. So David moves with his new wife up to Towson. He becomes the state's attorney for Baltimore County in 1879, president of the Maryland State Board of Law Examiners, president of the Maryland State Bar Association, and captain of the Towson Volunteer Maryland National Guard. So you have someone, let's just remember again that he is not only a Confederate soldier, but family born and raised in the South, and continues to have family in the South, his mother and etc. So these ideals do not leave David McIntosh, and they follow him here, and then he becomes someone of high standard in the Towson community. So policies and laws are going to follow that. His wife, Virginia Johnson Pegram, like I said, was born in Richmond, Virginia. And during the Civil War, she was a nurse to Confederate soldiers and remained involved with the Confederates women's organizations in Maryland until her death. These organizations were like Daughters of Confederate Soldiers, other organizations such as that. Her brothers, William, John, and James, were both Confederate soldiers in Virginia. Her brother James was a major and was at one point captured and a prisoner of war. So down here you can see where they're talking a little bit about her brothers. They were called the Fighting Pegram family, and the 10 sons of the elder Pegrams. So they were really well known. Of the 10 young Pegrams, 5 were killed in battle, and one was so severely wounded that an amputation of his leg was necessary. So this was in the newspaper in 1881, talking about them. The children that Virginia and David had were Virginia Pegram, Margaret, who married William Waller Morton, and David Gregg Jr., who had married Charlotte Ryman and had 3 children: J. Ryman McIntosh, Virginia Pegram McIntosh Williams, and David Gregg McIntosh. David Gregg Jr. was a state senator. And all 3 of these generations, including J. Ryman, were members of Trinity until his death in 1990. So for over 100 years, the McIntosh family were members of Trinity. To the left here, we have Colonel David Greg McIntosh. This is the family home he grew up in South Carolina. This is him in his older years. And this is Virginia, probably around the time they were married. When he died, it was huge. It continued, the press continued for a couple of weeks. You can see a full page obituary speaking about his love of the Confederacy and his children and his family and coming to Towson and all of the various jobs he held. And I think what is really important is like the one in the middle here only spoke about his Confederacy and his serving within the Battle of Gettysburg. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel. And when there was a retreat to Appomattox, he commanded 2 battalions of artillery and was a close friend, like I said, of Jefferson Davis. And I know that when he died, the Confederate flag was hung on his casket. And then he was taken down to Richmond to be buried. This is when Virginia died. Same thing. It made the news and was spoken about, not only about her family, but also about her husband's. And again, funeral at Trinity, but buried in Virginia. Here we had the Confederate Daughters meet, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which I was talking about, and they met only a couple weeks after David passed away. And so what we see here is that Mrs. David G. McIntosh was the president of this organization in Baltimore. And there are other names here that go on to be high society and etc. And there's a full page ad regarding the Confederacy getting together to honor Lee and put up some statutes. And it includes the McIntosh family as being part of that. There are domestic servants that they had in 1880. They had Arthur and Clara, both born in Virginia, with a hostler and cook, and they remained in Baltimore and worked in the city in 1900 as laborer, and he was a tanner, and she was a midwife. And in 1900, they had Lucy Reed, who married Jordan Reed, who was a laborer in Sparrows Point at the time that Lucy was in the employ of the McIntosh family. Lucy had 7 living children. Armstead was born in 1877 and worked at Beth Steel and the furnace, and Agnes, born in 1873, were living with them at the time. They went back to Virginia after the death of her husband. And Armstead working at Beth Steel in the furnace, that's the hardest job that was there. It was mainly cleaning out the slag that was left over, and in order to melt down metal, it has to be really hot. And even when they're cleaning out the furnace, even though the furnace is no longer going, it is extremely hot. And so it's the worst job at Beth Steel. And that was usually preserved for people who were African Americans. And then the last person they had was Samuel Jones. And he was born in 1878 in Maryland, but I don't find anything else about him. With that last name, Jones, it's not uncommon to have multiple Samuel Joneses. The next person I want to talk about is Colonel Milton Walters Offutt. And on Sunday, we had one of his descendants in the crowd with us. And she came in for the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project. They were having a conference on Saturday. And so she came in to attend that. Milton Walters Offutt was actually accused by the sheriff of being the leader of the lynching of Howard Cooper in 1885 in Towson. If you can see where the jail is right here, this is where Milton Offutt lived. He was living in the Bosley house at that time. He purchased it. And here is the courthouse, and here is Offutt, and here's the jail where Howard Cooper was. And this is the picture of the house. It's now empty, but it was the Presbyterian home in West Towson. And so this is their home. I think this is like in the 1930s when it just was changed over to the Presbyterian home. This is a picture of it right before it closed. It's in walking distance and in hearing distance of the jail. So he was born in Harrisonburg, Virginia, to Thomas Zadok Offutt and Maria Elizabeth Walters. Thomas was a doctor and also a gentleman farmer, which meant that he was an enslaver in Maryland. During the Civil War, he was actually a doctor for the Confederacy, a surgeon for the Confederacy. Milton joined the bar in 1881. He was too young to serve in the Civil War, obviously, but he practiced law with David McIntosh in Towson. So again, we see these connections within Towson and also within Trinity. And he married a woman who I will show next at Trinity, and her family were Trinity parishioners. She died, and after she died, he married Emily Jenkins in 11th of October, 1905. He remained married to her until he died, and then she married his brother. So, and they continued to live in this property until about the 1930s, when their daughter sold the property and sold most of the other properties they owned up in this direction, one of which is where Towson High School, the property that was built on, and also the YMCA, that property. So this is the story of Howard Cooper. And just to show that it says here that the summary disposition of the case would not have occurred if the friends of the condemned man had not resorted to the extreme measures they took to raise funds. So basically, they're blaming Howard for his own lynching. The lynching took place after midnight so that they would not lynch him on a Sunday. And some met up in Ruxton, which is where the crime took place, the original crime, which was the attack of Katie Gray. Howard had been found guilty and was sentenced to death. He was awaiting an appeal and had just received the money for that appeal to the Supreme Court that day. And so that was basically the dog whistle for the people who had been wanting and calling for Howard to be lynched for months. And so apparently, according to, if you see over here, this is a newspaper article that was published outside of Maryland that said, "It is my belief that the man on horseback was Milton Offutt, a lawyer of Towsontown." This is Sheriff Knight saying this. So he said this to a group of reporters, but only a few reporters ran with the story, and none of which were in Maryland. And that's not a surprise, because the owner of the Sun paper was a Towson friend, and so and sympathizer to Confederacy, and also to I guess you would say to situations like any of the lynchings that took place in Maryland. The coverage was not to condemn lynching. So Milton was not named in any Maryland paper, but obviously he was known to the people who were in Towson. We see that Dr. R.C. Massenberg, who we saw prior to in the other situation, he examined the body. They had an inquest right away on Howard's death and murder. And what they found was that he was actually strangled. His neck was not broken. And the body stayed there until 9:20 in the morning, so that a crowd had gathered during the lynching right after midnight and continued to trickle through, taking pieces of the rope once the body had been taken down, pieces of the tree. And it showed here that the crowd demanding pieces of the rope. A well-known gentleman who was cutting up the rope for distribution was frequently appealed to say, "Don't forget me." Boys struggled for fragments of the cord. There was a considerable delay and trouble in getting the body carried into the jail from the tree. Several colored men were asked to help, but they refused. When summoned by an officer to assist, they said there was no law in the land to compel them to carry the body. They also said, "Let those who killed him carry him in." The body was finally placed on a board and taken into the jail through the rear door and placed on the brick floor. And then his mother came and collected him, and his mother was recorded as saying that she heard the gang of people coming through, so she knew her son was going to be lynched. In the inquest, what's very interesting, which was held at 10 o'clock, you see D. Preston Parr is one of the jurors. He was actually the foreman. Why this is very important was because his daughter is who marries Milton Offutt. And so obviously there's going to be a bias. And also within this crowd are other names, Sheely. My great-great-grandfather, J.A. Kopp, was in this crowd as well. And the witnesses were Dr. Massenberg and Piper. Piper, Parr, both of which were members of Trinity. So this was a huge event that took place in Towson. It was huge for a reason. It was to terrorize the Black community and to send a message that any kind of attack on a white woman was not going to go without proper justice, is I assume what they were thinking. So here is the death of Offutt when he died at a young age. And you can see the people who were present at his funeral being, again, people who were among Trinity parishioners. We have the Grayson family there, as well as here we see it says, "Resolved that we do hereby testify our high esteem for the character and memory of the deceased and our deep sense of the loss which the community has sustained in the death of an active, public-spirited, and devoted citizen, and which this bar has sustained by the removal of one of its most active and useful members." So there were addresses made by Grayson, Yellett, Enzer, all members of Trinity. All of them spoke in the highest terms of Colonel Offutt's character and ability, and the sincerest sorrow and sense of personal loss were voiced. That he was a large-hearted, broad-minded, charitable, sympathetic, loyal, kindly, and compatible. It was these grand qualities of his mind and heart that attracted him to hosts of friends who deeply deplore his death. But it was the domestic circle that his genial, attractive, and lovable disposition shone forth the brightest. Again, he's known to be the lynching leader, so it's very painful to see this obituary, one, taking up an entire side of a page, but also seeing a majority of these people talking about him are also the lawmakers and lawyers and senators of our town, talking about how amazing he was. So it had to be very painful for especially people who recognized his involvement in the lynching to look at that and feel anything but disdain. His wife, Nanny Parr, like I said, was born to D. Preston Parr, who we saw, and Ann Lone of Baltimore County. Both her father and mother were Southern sympathizers and outwardly supported the Southern troops by supplying them with aid and care during the war. And she had married Milton Offutt on the October 27, 1886 at Trinity. That was just over a year after the lynching. And she died May 28, 1892, without any children. So we have here about her father, who is a member of Trinity. And we see that during the war, he was a staunch supporter of the Confederacy, constantly passing through the lines, carrying supplies to the Confederate soldiers. After he was engaged in several business enterprises, being at one time owner and manager of the Smedley House at Towson, he was magistrate for several terms, and he also served as assessor. Mr. Parr's wife was Miss Lone, who was with her sisters, one of the wife's ex-mayors, Banks. That was the mayor of Baltimore. And the other wife of Mr. Emmett Banks was a famous Southern sympathizer and did much to alleviate the sufferings of Southern prisoners passing through Baltimore on their way to Northern prisons. And so this was the obituary written in 1900. And so up here we see how Nanny and Offutt were married by Reverend Powers at Trinity. And David Preston Parr was a co-owner of famous stoneware pottery. And so if you look up this pottery now, it is extremely coveted pottery. And you can find it on sale with various auction houses, and it is extremely expensive pottery that was made here in Baltimore. But I think the enterprise began in Virginia with his uncle. And so that's all I had, actually. We had other discussions, so it took a little bit longer, but because in the crowd, we also had a rector,
Right,
or a warden, I believe, from Holy Nativity,
right.
where Reverend Power's son was. So it was interesting to have the various members of all of these folks be in the crowd, and they're also members of the Baltimore County Coalition, and how it all ends up coming right back to Trinity too. So it was really, really interesting. And I think what we wanted to drive home and continue to drive home is like, Towson was the center, the seat of the county, the powerhouse. And that powerhouse on Sunday was attended at Trinity by everyone. I mean, the who's who went there, and the power makers went there. And so it just yet again shows, like, to be seen or see anyone at Trinity was to potentially make your career, to make alliances. All we see are these marriages in between these Trinity families. You've got Blue Book families here within the church. And so, but at the same time, while you have a lot of Confederate sympathizers, and you do in Towson, you do in Baltimore, Maryland is weird at that time because it is a border state. And so what you're going to have is, you're going to have people who have close ties to the South and feel comfortable in Maryland. They don't feel comfortable going to New York because they're not going to find the same kind of mentality. So it is a unique place to be. And then when you find these same people, again, with the power they held in the South, holding power in the North, you have an understanding of how absolutely difficult it must have been for citizens of East Towson and Sandy Bottom, and having the largest Black free population during the Civil War, and also having auction houses. It was a unique place, Baltimore, and unique in terrible ways and wonderful ways, but also you're having this idea of two sets of people who want to be close to the South for different reasons, for the exact opposite reasons. You have people who've been freed or who found freedom, who want to stay close enough to the South so they can get back if this place ever becomes free, and then you have people from the South who want to be close enough to be close to their family, but not have the persecution that they feel follows the Civil War. So, I mean, it sets up for a very unique state and county. So we'll have more this coming week.
Well, I can't wait. I think that this has just been so remarkable, learning about how so many things connected right here.
Yeah.
And it's just it's amazing. It's all I can say. And I can't thank you enough for doing this work and for sharing it with us, because you know, I feel like I'm learning big chunks of leaps and bounds. And so last week I didn't even know where Sandy Bottom was.
Right.
And now I do. And it's so strange because, you know, once you know something, how it keeps opening up to you. That my stepdaughter went to a field trip to Hampton Mansion yesterday.
Oh, wow.
And that, you know, the way that, and I was like, I have actually never been, because it, you know, it was a place, you know. But having her, she's heard me talking about this, and she's, you know, she was asking questions. She's like, so tell me about Sandy Bottom, and tell me about this, and tell me about that. And they're looking at her like, where are you coming from, girl?
Right.
It's just been pretty remarkable.
That's awesome. Yeah.
So thank you, you know, for doing this work, for sharing it with us, and I can't wait for next week.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we'll see if it doesn't get reported. We can always do this.
We can, but I'm hoping that it's so much better when we can get a little bit of the conversation, particularly as you said, we're getting a very interesting mix of people coming to have this conversation. So
yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Well, see you on Sunday.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.